our goal in this panel is to really talk about the intersection of private capital and this historic wave of public policy that we've now put in place to try to accelerate the climate transition. So that's our goal here, and we've got two of the best leaders I can think of in the private sector to talk about that. So to tee that up, I want to make 2 points at the front. The first is that we have seen in the past 2 years, in response to the piece of legislation that have been passed, infrastructure, CHIPS, and the Inflation Reduction Act, a historic response from the private sector, the American private sector and the global private sector. Last year, to the end of this second quarter, $213 billion of clean energy investment. That's actual investment in the economy. That's up 165% from 5 years ago. And most of the debate we're having in the US today is whether the private sector response to the Inflation Reduction Act will be 2 times or 3 times greater than we thought just a year ago. So extraordinary response from the private sector already. That's point one. Point two is the goal of this conversation is not to try to identify all the ways in which everything is working great. It's to get very concrete about the ways in which the private sector and the public sector could be working more effectively together, because we're at a moment where that's exactly what we need. I was joking with Alan and Saloni and saying that at least Saloni and I are of the vintage of the show, the MTV The Real World. How many people can remember or recall MTV's The Real World? Okay. So the tagline of the MTV The Real World, the beginning of reality television, the tagline was, "This is what happens when people stop being nice and start being real." And so I'm going to ask both Saloni and Alan, who are both very nice people, that while you can be nice, I really want you guys, I want to get you guys to be real about the ways in which this historic wave of public policy, and in particular the Department of Energy, the loan program and the other Department of Energy programs, actually feel when you're on the side of trying to allocate capital or align capital in private markets. So that's where we're going to go. So I want to start, Saloni, with you. You're in the growth stage of trying to launch an investment company to invest in climate solutions. And I have to imagine that almost every one of the investments that you're looking at, part of the underwriting case is whether and in what context companies are actually going to be able to access federal money. How's that going?
Yeah. Well, I will say, I mean, to be able to sit here and talk about a firm that is a commercial return investment firm dedicated to the deployment of climate solutions, I think it's a testament to everything you said around the progress we've made. So I'll start with that you know, it's a privilege to be in that position. I'd say that said, you know, you've got a federal government apparatus meeting the needs of innovative, capital-consumptive companies where every day is a day closer to running out of money, and commercial return investors who are really looking for data to make risk-adjusted return decisions where uncertainty is risk. You know, that meeting the transparency and timing of a federal government process, you know, what could go wrong? It's all going swimmingly. So I'd say, you know, that really is kind of the knot that we try to unravel. You know, ex ante, as we're looking at investments, can we underwrite access to government funding for our companies? Candidly, it's hard. I mean, look, I think Jigger, Loan Programs Office, have done just a remarkable job. His Christmas card list must be extraordinarily long because he's got a bunch of best friends out in the innovation. Every CEO we talk to, I think one other investor I spoke to made the comment, when an impenetrable process meets a wildly optimistic CEO, you know, the challenge we have is we often need to kind of haircut their expectations of what they're going to receive down pretty far, almost all the way to zero. So on an ex ante basis, it's challenging. On an ex post basis, certainly we work very hard to ensure that our companies are availing themselves to the relevant programs, but it can be a challenging kind of road to navigate, certainly for young companies with constrained resources, trying to allocate them on a, you know, sort of highest and best use basis.
And Alan, you've seen these sort of capital deployment cycles over multiple cycles. I'm curious, does this feel different, and what are you seeing, particularly from your clients, in terms of most pain points and places where this is hard, even if this is different.
Yeah, so point number one, I may be in the generation to see that show too, but I'm of a generation where if I didn't see it yesterday, I forgot. So, anyway, so on your point, yes, I've seen this. I think it's very, very different in many ways. If you really go back in the days leading up for many years, government dealt with externalities. So things like smog or anything else, the government would deal with externalities either through investing and or taxing or penalties, and then the commercial sector just had to follow the rules that were set up. And so, for example, the first wave of sustainability, say wind and solar and some battery and things, they were very specific technologies that you knew could be deployed in lots of different places, and therefore creating a subsidy to make it, affordable and make the investment return. To Saloni's point, the investors knew that with that subsidy, it could be built and it could be deployed and they would get a return. And so it brought the learning curve down in a very significant way. This time around, the issues that we're dealing with are way bigger than the government can deal with the externalities itself. It needs a wave of capital. The good news of that is, I believe, part of the reason I got into this so heavily is, as a recovering research director and economist, as we know, that people were all thinking that either, companies should invest in profitability in the future or companies should invest in stakeholder and what's needed. What people don't realize is exactly what's needed for the global economy is a major wave of investment in new sustainable technology. If we went through all of the things. So businesses want to invest. They want to invest because it's the right thing, but also because it's actually going to be the most profitable and sustainable thing. So bringing them together, though, now that we have a new wave of a lot of different technologies, not just a couple that are already developed, but on all these different states, and bringing them into an ecosystem that they can be deployed in, because not all of them can just be build one here or build one there. You got to have an environment and an ecosystem that they can fit into, is a way more complicated formula. And so real quickly, I will say, I'll stop praising them, but the bills that we passed were very, very positive for being the catalyst to get this going. If we're going to do this, let government weigh in, and now let's say let the business and investment follow. And I'll break it down to really three quick sectors in my mind. I'll try and do it quickly. One, I think there's the existing ones that are already mature. Subsidies for things like wind and solar and batteries are going to create a nice big wave of that, and we're already seeing it. The only thing there is we also want to bring it back and have it manufactured here, and there's a lot of issues about how to get that done that are significant, right? I'd say the second wave of these things are a lot of the new technologies. Well, the second one are newer technologies that have come out of the lab, have been out and for a while, and large industrial companies are willing to take them on because they're far enough along, they think the engineering will work. And so things like, we work with Occidental on direct air capture in the Permian, or Dow Chemical with the fourth generation nuclear, et cetera. And I think the biggest problem there, if you talk to all these large corporates, they want to invest a lot behind these types of projects, but they don't know where the regulatory and permitting environment will allow them to go. And if we got to get more clarity on that, the best we can do on that will unlock a lot of capital. And then the last are the types of companies that Saloni knows well and was talking about, a lot of these startups that are still with the founders and everything else. And there the problem really is that it's very hard for the investors with large pools of capital that want to invest in these things, but they want a clear sight line to how it's going to work. And these founders are saying, give me the money and I'll figure it out, and that doesn't quite work. So that's where I think, in terms of the government's role, I think the Department of Energy loan program is great, but it'd really be good. Right now it's at the senior stack, and there's a lot of money that'll play in the senior stack. But there's really the gap is down here in the lower part. So if the DOE could come down, be able to take more risk in things they look at, even if it's side by side with other investors, I think that would be a catalyst that could get things going.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of capital once you have bounded risk return. So for the projects, I think where the challenge is, our venture stack was really built in the context of innovating digitally. And now what we need to do is innovate in physical systems, and that's expensive. So is innovating in ones and zeros, but it is doubly expensive to deploy that innovation into physical assets. And so the challenge that we're seeing is, you've got companies who are trying to iterate on business models that require deployment, but very early deployments into physical assets. And it's so expensive, and the venture stack can't tolerate that magnitude of capital going into that type of iteration in all cases, and in some really necessary cases. And so I think to your point, the government kind of stepping into, I think once you unlock and bound the risk return, there's project money to be had in the private sector as well as in places like the Loan Programs Office. But how do you get more of that pulled, really in the stuff getting done on balance sheet at companies, but that is expensive?
So let me try to unpack that, and let's stay at this challenge. Alan, your third category, and I want to come back to the other categories, and get a little more granular about what you think would actually help here. Because one of the things that we thought a lot about when we were trying to put the Inflation Reduction Act together was, wherever possible, putting subsidies in a position where the government's role was simply just to provide certainty of access to subsidy in a neutral manner, technology neutral manner across time. Wherever possible, that's a solution that has the greatest ability to actually drive private capital in. But what I hear you guys saying is, in these earlier stage innovations, particularly where the innovation needs to move through a physical system, you need a different set of models or different tools. But we've got, for the first time in history, a supercharged loan program. We've got an agency that has the capacity to at least do forward commitments to try to create demand in markets that don't exist today. We've got grant programs. We've got a bunch of different tools, right? Some would say that's a challenge, that's a problem, because government might use those tools incorrectly. But talk to me about, in practice, what would actually improve things? And Saloni, I want to start with you. You mentioned sort of the timing inconsistency problem. How do you solve that?
Look, I think part of it is, how do you help to crystallize or at least bound the probability of some type of award? And you just outlined sort of grant, loan programs, other sort of research profile funding. Part of the challenge, if you're a young company, is navigating it all. Mm-hmm. And then from an investor perspective, it's pricing it. And so, I'm not going to come up with a mechanism that I'm sure is immediately implementable, but I'd say there's sort of two pieces of that. One, for a company, is which road to go down to invest limited internal resources and even investigating and doing the work on which program should I apply for, when is the application due, how much could the award be, and what activity will it fund? So that's sort of one bucket. And then from an investor perspective, if there were and I understand there are lots of reasons why this is hard, but if there were sort of a clear set of stage gates and milestones within a given award program, in terms of what's the probability of receiving an award, what level of sort of readiness am I at, is this project at, relative to what the program needs to see for me to access it, that could perhaps help investors say, look, rather than discounting this to zero, let me actually put some value on it in my underwriting case that this capital might materialize later on down the line. Mm-hmm. So those are sort of, a couple within the context of the current programs, perhaps.
So more transparency around gates and milestones.
Yep.
And more capacity to help young companies actually understand.
Just navigate where to start.
Yeah.
Because I don't think you can change, look, ultimately every day companies are burning capital. You can't change that timing constraint that companies live with. So it's a little bit of, how do you provide, more clarity on the process to companies so that they can pull forward some of the capital.
So I want to jump, Alan, back to your sort of second category. And you mentioned the issue of permitting. And I hear about this in almost every conversation. But I also, sometimes I have the concern that people say permitting is a problem, and that could mean everything in the world or nothing in the world. And when you're working with your clients around projects that are not the earliest stage, but projects that are trying to actually get scale and put steel in the ground, what do you think are the things that would actually move the needle the most in terms of moving capital?
I think there's several things that could happen. I want to very quickly to what Saloni was saying. The other thing we have to be about some of these early stage, if you go through the private markets over the years, you need, there is a big wave of enthusiasm around a new set of technologies, and then there's a phase where you find out that it's not nearly as easy as you thought, and it's going to take longer, whether that was .coms or whether, and so we need to be realistic in putting out the milestones and things of what we believe if we incentivize capital to go into some of these earlier things. Do not think it's going to show up with finished projects in the next 18 months or 2 years. It just can't happen. There needs to be an infrastructure like the Wintel Alliance to be able to know that you could do this and find out that. So that's really important. Now on the regulatory and permitting both, the thing that we need is, if it's possible on highly critical things, can the government set up a set of standards federally that if you meet the following conditions, you can then deploy this technology in places that meet those conditions? Because right now, as we've joked about, Brian, we have this thing, oxymoron, called the United States of America. And so if you've got to build something, I can tell you about a pipeline, for example, that somebody mentioned to me today, a client of ours that's 95% built to take natural gas from West Virginia up to New England, and yet it's 5% can't get built because it crosses some one place that is stopping it. So instead, they ship it down to the Gulf Coast, and they burn all this fuel to ship it up to New England, because one municipality says can't finish here. So that's really the issue that people have is, if I'm going to invest billions of dollars to invest in these new technologies, show me the rules. I want to know what rules I have to meet to be able to deploy it on a significant basis. So if there's a way to override the local as long as it meets certain conditions, that would be very good. The other thing I think that could be created, I tried this on something else, is to create a government incentive program. It was actually based on the concept of the whole Arne Duncan thing that he did with education, to say, so we will grant to municipalities, localities, everything else, we'll give you a grant to deploy certain technologies if you substantially cut the permitting time. And let's just say, that way you don't have to get into the specifics, but you could say, look, on balance, it takes 12 months to get this or any of these things done. If you want this loan forgiven, you have to get it done in 6 months, right? And that would be a good incentive to get things that are known to be okay and that will get some follow-on investment behind them.
In the wake of the infrastructure bill passing, for the first time, the Department of Transportation, as part of a public transit, regional transit grant award, said to municipalities, we will only provide the grant funding if you have a strategy in place to build affordable housing. And it was a similar sort of concept. And I think what I hear you saying is race to the top, or say you have to have the necessary conditions in place from a permitting perspective.
I'll tell you another one. I think, for example, the best place to put small nuclear reactors or SMRs would be where there are already coal mines, right? So you're going to get some resistance. Except I know, talking to the coal mine workers, they want them, right? So you could say again, if you're putting a reactor near this, we will give you a subsidy provided you're going to have a training program so that all the people that are working in that region will now not just lose their jobs, they'll be able to get these new jobs because they will be trained in them. So you got to put the pieces together like that.
All right, so we're going across the stages, help early stage companies actually understand what's out there, provide clearer milestones in the process of the awarding of subsidy, particularly in DOE programs, clearer rules of the road around permitting, siting, technology capability, and some degree of race to the top around trying to push that down to the state and local level. That's a lot of practical solutions for 15 minutes. So I want to shift over to optimism for a second, which is, I'm curious, you guys both in different ways did sort of say that it feels like this is a different, the game has changed in some fundamental ways. Any examples that this audience, that we could build on, that the federal government can build on, where you've seen it really work, that we're going to need a new, unique type of partnership between the public and private sector, that we're going to need these tools of deployment capital in the public sector actually drive private capital at scale? From anecdote to big thing, and anything where you've seen a spark of this working that we can build on? I
think certainly, the awards or the conditional commitments that the LPO has made, I think, are laying a really great groundwork for that. Some of what the USDA has done, Climate Smart Commodities Program, has been. Can I ask you a question on the LPO thing? Yeah.
So interesting for you to say that. So when you guys see conditional commitments,
yes,
how do you think about that from an investment standpoint?
It's a term sheet, and it's a pretty strong term sheet. And so I'd say the challenge with it is it comes, it obviously accrues to the benefit of the company who has made it to the other side of the process. And so again, it doesn't go in the case ex ante, but if you're in the company and you're looking at, say, a subsequent round, if the company is holding a conditional commitment, you can price that. And it is seen as, and the terms are generally not publicly disclosed, but if you're doing diligence on a company, you can get access to at what terms, at what milestones, in what amounts, to fund what, and you can build that in. So it's interesting. It's not motivating incremental private capital. It's sort of me being able to underwrite they won't need my private capital because they will have a public source, and in so doing, sort of potentially driving a return profile that is more investable or more investable at scale. All right,
you're going to go to climate smart agriculture.
Oh, I mean, just to say that I think is, it's an interesting example of, it required some coalition building between innovators, growers, and to apply to award programs that were, in a sector where I think innovation is hard, and because of just what growing cycles are, we had a few of our companies that were able to kind of get access to funding that way, and it's small, but it's catalyzing activity that would not have happened but for the program.
Alan?
Well, I think something you said, I mean, look, we're seeing a large wave of investment coming in. Now, we're worried about it getting across the line on a lot of these things, but the fact is we've already stimulated a large amount of capital to start to get deployed and a large amount of people to start projects. Some of them are going to work, and hopefully we'll get more of them to work if we get things better. But some of the things, for example, that are kicking in a new way, take the DAC hubs, the billions of dollars going into DAC hubs. It's just a very clear thing. There's DAC technology. Here's somebody to say, let's get them done here, and that's creating a lot of investment right behind those DAC hubs. And so there are signs that this could work. We're just, as we started this conversation, saying, how can we make sure it keeps going and don't only get maybe, say, the easy ones done, but let's keep going and try and keep stepping up and get the harder ones done. And there's one thing I want to bring up that people, they keep poo-pooing me, whether it's Jigger on me, and as I said, I think, and actually I know there's something going on now with what we're working on nuclear, which we work on hard with the Senate and stuff, is a number of companies are going to be willing to buy the output of the nuclear at a much higher price because they know that if they're going to be, especially some of the high-end companies, data centers and things like that, if they're going to have to keep building, for AI and all these things, more, data centers, they're going to have to subsidize how those data centers consume. So those things are starting to work. And I would like, and I still strongly tell people, there's an enormous desire on companies' part to buy credits, carbon credits. And everybody says, not that big a deal. I think it's billions and billions of dollars. What the government needs to do is, as they're designing, these programs work, then say, okay, that qualifies as a carbon credit. And you will see billions of dollars go and voluntarily buy those credits for companies that are creating them, which will, let's say, double the amount of money they're getting from the government in these programs.
The other last thing I'll just quickly say is I do think, just as someone who's had to go to raise funds from people for a fund that is deploying capital into climate solutions, whether it's the infrastructure bill, the IRA, what's going on in the EU, I would say that it is feeling like it is inevitable that we are on a decarbonized path. Are we going as quickly as we need to? Are we doing it across all the sectors we need to? Of course, we're all pushing to go harder and faster, but the inevitability of the direction of travel changes the conversation a lot. And so that is my optimistic.
And I'll tell you one other optimistic, really optimistic. If we get some of this stuff deployed, right, it is going to be deployed faster if we get it started. We are the country with the most innovation in all of these things. Unfortunately, we're lagging some of the rest of the world in deployment of some of these same things, but we're now trying to catch up. But if we get started, if we get some of them out and deployed, it will happen in a much faster way overseas than it will here. And that's a very important thing for a whole bunch of reasons. But I say it's like when mobile phones came along, they would be deployed faster where there weren't already landline phones, right? But that was just a consumer device. But now if you think about it, if we get some of these new technologies going, and now that we have to reshore and find raw materials and find new places, a lot of countries could go deploy this with a wave of investment behind it. And because climate is a global phenomenon, we don't only have to worry about what we spend to reduce climate. Anything we start that triggers this in other parts of the world also will reduce climate on a global basis. And that's the thing I'm most optimistic about.
This is a lot of optimism coming from the two of these hard-headed people, which gets me excited, maybe a little worried, but gets me excited. So I want to end here. You got to jump on it, Alan, with the lightning round of lifting up, and you guys helped me get there, which is if we lift up and we think about the real challenge here, which is meeting the moment of the climate crisis globally, and the notion that we really do have a decade or less to really make inevitable progress on this issue. And we take for granted that the United States has made a lot of progress, and hopefully progress that will drive global progress as well. Lightning round to you all of, if you had your one or two things that we don't have, that we haven't done yet, and you can't answer global carbon tax. It's because I knew they were both going to answer global carbon tax. Other than a global carbon tax, if you could wave your wand and do the lightning round and say, beyond the progress that we've made today, one or two things you put in your place that would really make it inevitable. I think
in the US.
Inevitable that the momentum toward decarbonization was going to accelerate over the course of the next decade, and that private capital was going to drive that. What would you say? And you each have less than a minute. Saloni, you get to go first.
CBAM in the US, is that the same thing as a carbon tax?
Well, is it based on embedded emissions?
Yeah.
So a U.S.-based border mechanism based on embedded emissions without an explicit price in the United States, but with the ability to export that emissions-based.
Export our desire to procure goods with the lower embedded emissions content.
Provocative. You could find an interesting bipartisan coalition in the U.S. and a lot of angry diplomats in Europe. Alan.
Sounds about right.
Real quick, I think the thing that would be the biggest change is, quite frankly, the problem we have today is something you said about optimization. People either want to maximize this or maximize that. They don't want to get in a room and say, how do we optimize what we get done? And the biggest sincerely impediment to getting these things done, when we say we have to hurry, we do, but you got to hurry in a smart way. And so the people that are the most zealous about fighting climate, these environmentalists, they just want to scream for go all clean, get rid of fossil fuels, shut those companies down, don't ever invest in them. And that gets in the way of what we have to do, right? If we could get the environmentalists and the corporate sector and the government sector in one room to say, let's talk about, for example, let's let the fossil fuel industry decarbonize everything it can in its industry and use its infrastructure to help us deploy the new ones and things like that. It's just if we could all come in a room instead of scream at each other from the other side. And I'd really like to see, environmentalists take a step back and say, how do we now work together with all of these people instead of just saying, we want to shut that down and do all of this, because it will not work if they don't.
Okay, We covered a lot of ground in a short time, but I walk away from this conversation more optimistic that we can deploy the capital that we need to at scale. And we got a set of pragmatic, I hope our DOE colleagues are taking careful notes, because a set of very pragmatic ideas here too that hopefully we can build on as well. So Saloni, Alan, thank you very much. And we're on to the next phase.